Well, I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but that's the problem with timetables. So, what I want to talk about is where Europe is. Obviously, Europe of the European Union is central to my theme. But broadly speaking, I think the question that is in the air, although not necessarily many people approach it this way, is what kind of Europe do we want to live in? The problem that arises or has arisen over the years is that a great deal of power has been transferred to Brussels, to the Commission, to some extent the European Parliament, Council, perfectly rationally and indeed reasonably. If you think about environmental protection or food safety, it's perfectly proper that these are supervised, controlled, regulated at the transnational or supranational level. The difficulty is that these various powers acquire a critical mass. They're obviously not terribly easy to claw back if a particular country might want to do that. But crucially, the accountability of those who run the system in the first place, the Commission, is very weak. It's not non-existent. European Parliament does some of it. The member states do some of it, but a lot of it is so technical that we really don't know. It's very difficult for the average citizen, unless they're deeply involved in one topic or another, to make sense of exactly what is going on. Added to that, there is the structural problem that we have 27, well, technically 28 member states, but the United Kingdom is leaving, with about 450 million citizens. And how on earth do you overcome the structural problem of the distance between the citizen and indeed the political entity that we refer to as Brussels? You may recall that during, I think it was the second Irish referendum, the Irish media started using the word disconnect. And what I interpret by this is that it's terribly difficult for the average European citizen to see themselves, him or herself, as a citizen both of his or her own country, where a lot of the political action takes place, and of the European Union. I think that's a difficult thing to do intellectually, let alone politically. It doesn't mean it's impossible. And sometimes it does happen, for example, which I've been working on a great deal through the European Citizens Initiative, but it all moves very slowly. And so it's very difficult, as I've been suggesting, to make Brussels, specifically, I think, the Commission, accountable for what it does. On top of that, the Commission is supposed to be the guardian of the treaties. Now, to me, that implies a considerable degree of political neutrality. And we know that no institution is ever completely neutral politically. I absolutely accept this, but the difficulty that I see with the Commission, to some extent the European Parliament as well, is that it's been captured by liberal thinking, fundamentalist liberal thinking, hyper-liberal thinking, whatever term you want to use, which is utterly committed to a particular agenda, clearly freedom of the markets, without restraints, and social liberalism, which really, it's paradoxical, because on the one hand it promotes a kind of hyper-individualism, on the other hand it accepts the legitimacy of certain collective identities and promotes these. Obviously I'm thinking of LGBT and gender and things of this kind. But it selects, you see, that it doesn't say anything about the rights of linguistic minorities. I've had the personal experience of going to the Commission and saying, look, really undesirable things are happening in a particular European country with a particular minority, and the Commission simply says nothing to do with that as member state competence. Now, I'm sorry, either you protect all minorities or you don't protect any. It's there in the treaty, by the way, it's in Article 2 of the treaty, so it's a basic European value. Well, except that that is not a part of the liberal agenda, because the liberal agenda sees these particular or particularist identities as a threat to its universalism. And this is where we get into serious problems when you get a number of member states who are saying, well, wait a minute, this is not the kind of Europe that we want to see. Obviously, Hungary, with its newly elected successful government, I'm a member of this party, is one of these. I think we can see similar trends in Poland, to some extent in Romania, quietly so I think in Slovenia and Czech Republic. Slovakia is in a state of chaos at the moment. It's very hard to make sense of it. But what I think is extremely interesting, that this isn't just a post-communist or Central European phenomenon. In Italy, in the recent elections, two, I'll call them Eurocritical parties, the Lega and the Five Star Movement, together get well over 50% of the votes. So we're looking at a phenomenon which I think is fairly widespread. There's the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany. Interestingly, in France, you get analogous movements on the extreme left and the extreme right. It's very hard to know what they really want, except that they don't want the Brussels run Europe in the way that it exists at the moment. The particular difficulty that Central Europe has been facing is that the free market policies of the Commission, policed quite stringently, mean that state aid may not be given to economic enterprises. And there's total freedom of movement for capital. So what has happened is that Western capital, or indeed global capital, has entered Central Europe and has certainly brought some benefits, but it's very clear from figures that were published very recently, figures published, by the way, by the left-wing economist Piketty, whose name, if you don't know, you should know, that over the last, I think, 10 or 15 years, more capital has left through the activities of multinationals, the Central European region, than the region has received through cohesion funds and structural funds from the European Union. This is not, I think, a very happy situation, because politically these countries joined the European Union in 2004 and 2007, 2011 on a kind of promise that we would catch up. We would reach the same standard as the EU 15 average. This clearly hasn't happened. So the question is being asked, why is it that, let's say, workers in the Czech Republic do the same quality work as workers in Germany, but receive 1/3, 40% of the wages, the remuneration? There's an unevenness, possibly an injustice, which is increasingly making its felt in the politics of Central Europe. And Brussels, or many people in Brussels, see this as Euroscepticism. They reject it. There was one particular incident. You may know this story, that work has been done on various things which are on sale in supermarkets, Western supermarkets in Central Europe. One of these is Nutella, and it turns out that the quality of the Nutella sold in Slovakia, or I think in Hungary, is lower than that sold in Austria. Let me add anecdotally that I go quite regularly to Vosmegye in southwestern Hungary, and I've been hearing this anecdotally for years. The Slovak health authorities actually did the tests. It's quite clear. So what the multinationals say, oh, we're catering to local tastes, but they never asked. And what I also particularly remember is a singularly nasty article in The Economist last summer saying these terrible Central Europeans, they really should shut up. So if you put all this together and add the key issue of migration to which Central Europe is opposed, you can see a very deep cleavage now between Central Europe and Brussels, which Brussels dismisses as anti-European, Eurosceptic or whatever, and the Central Europeans say, no, we are pro-Europe, but we want a different kind of Europe. And then the question is, can such a thing be? Well, if you believe in democracy, then first of all, you really have to believe in debate. And one of the things that's definitely worth debating is the kind of Europe that Europeans want to live in. If those in the West say this is Euroscepticism, we're not engaging in this, that simply makes the problem worse. It radicalizes people if they're ignored. I think it's a normal human response that you say something and it just disappears into the air because your debating partner refuses to engage with you, so you get more angry. And I think this is what is happening. I see dangers in this, but maybe I'm just a voice in the wilderness and nobody will listen to me, but maybe it'll break out 2 or 3 years down the line. If that is so, perhaps this is the first place where you've heard it. Thank you for your attention.